living 'cause I'm working for a living.
Hello again, this is Professor Watts. Today we're going to talk about factor incomes. And the goal for today's lesson is really just to develop some terminology. We're going to categorize different kinds of productive assets and then think about the income that those assets earn, and all this is from an economic point of view. So a lot of this terminology I hope you'll be familiar with, but there's some kind of nuanced ways in which we use the terms within economics. So that's really what we're going for. And then knowing these concepts in terms will allow us to build up theories of asset valuation, and then to start to understand how market forces change the values of assets. And all of this is going to be very useful knowledge for us in life and business, and thinking about what kind of jobs to pursue and thinking about how to invest our money and so on and so forth. So let's jump right in and define some terms. For economic usage, an asset is defined as a resource that produces a flow of services over time. We could be talking about production or consumption services, but we're talking about a durable good that produces a flow of services into the future. So we could be talking about a factory. Here's a steel mill, and this factory cranks out so many tons of steel every year. A tractor is an asset for the farmer. It helps him produce a crop every year, a valuable product. A home is an asset. It doesn't produce a product, it does produce a service, what we would call a consumption service, a nice place to live for you and your family. Money, of course, is an asset, and it's a kind of a general asset because money can be turned into any other asset. Where it might not be obvious what flow of services money produces over time, if you think about, well, what can you do with money? You could invest it into another asset really easily that produces a flow of services, or you could invest it in a financial asset that cranks out returns a flow of more money, a return on investment or a yield. So money is a general asset. Here's an example of that kind of financial asset that you could acquire with money. Here's a share of stock in Verizon Corporation. I chose Verizon. I actually looked up the top dividend yielding stocks on the Dow Jones Industrials average, and Verizon currently, recording this in June 2016, was yielding about 4% dividend yield. So you could, for every $100 you invested in Verizon stock, you would earn $4 income on that investment per year. So that's a financial asset that returns a flow of money back to you. And let's not leave out human capital, so the skill and ability of workers that allows them to produce services and earn income. So when we think about a worker, it's not just your body, it's not just your muscle power, it's your knowledge and skill, what we call human capital. Whereas the tractor over here, or the steel mill, would be physical capital. The knowledge and skill of this worker is called human capital, and that of course produces a flow of services, helps produce other goods, and earns a monetary income. Okay, so when talking about assets, there's a few subsidiary concepts we need to think about. One is liquidity. A liquid asset is one that can be readily converted into cash, and of course cash itself would be considered the most liquid asset of them all. Of the assets we just mentioned as examples, that stock certificate could be readily sold on any business day in the market at a current market price pretty much instantaneously, so it would be highly liquid. Your house is somewhat liquid. It might take months to sell it, so it's not perfectly liquid. That steel mill, same thing. It could be sold to another steel company, but that could take months or even maybe years. So that's not very liquid. Your human capital, your knowledge or your skill level, is not really liquidatable at all. You can't sell yourself into slavery. So we have a range of liquidity of various assets, with money being the most liquid, and then other assets being less and less liquid, depending on how thick the markets for them are. The financial asset is an intangible asset. The value is based on contractual obligations. So stocks, bonds, bank accounts are strictly financial assets. If you own shares of Verizon, you actually have a fractional title to all the other assets of that company. The board of directors of that company can decide to pay you part of their income they earn in the form of dividends, or they can reinvest them in the company, in which case the stock price might grow. So financial assets are still assets. They have a value and they produce income for you over time, or potentially so. They just don't have physical substance like a factory or a tractor or a house. Okay, so we have a good sense of assets, financial assets, physical assets. Let's talk about income, because this is ultimately about valuing assets, and to value assets we need to get a handle on the income assets earn. And for our purposes here, income is simply defined as a payment made to an asset or earned by an asset in its production of services. Now, to understand income, we need to recognize this stock versus flow distinction. Okay, stock is the value at a point in time. When we talk about assets, we often refer to the asset's capital value, whereas flow is the payments that accrue over time. So annual payment to a worker, the worker's wage, or the annual dividend yield on a share of stock, or the annual interest earnings on a bank account. Okay, those are all flow, and when we talk about income, we're talking about a flow. And we always gauge it over a time period, so we typically think about annual income. Stock, capital value at a point in time. So we could say, what's the value of all farm machinery in the U.S.? What's the value of all housing in the U.S.? What's the market capitalization of Verizon right now? We could look that up. We could say, Verizon, all the shares of Verizon all together are worth, actually I can look this up pretty easily here on Google, and we can see that Verizon's market capitalization, which is the total value of all the shares, currently worth $54 per share on June 21st. $221 billion. Well, that's the capital value. That's the stock concept. And then the income, I'm looking on the NASDAQ.com. Here's Verizon's income statement, annual incomes for the last 4 years. And we can see that they made a gross profit of $79 billion. Net profit here of about $18 billion. Okay, so there's the flow concept of income versus the stock concept of wealth or capital value. And finally, we need to think about the concept of risk. It's a very simple definition of risk for now. We're talking about the variability of an asset's income from period to period. Okay, so there's an idea that an asset will continue to produce a flow of goods and services, and therefore income, because it has to get paid for those goods or services into the future. But there's going to be some variability. And to think about risk, it's probably easiest to think about some very natural and obvious sources of risk. So think about the asset of farmland, and it's pretty easy to think about the source of variability in the income it earns, and the variability in the flow of output. What causes a variation in the amount of crop that a given piece of land produces? Well, that of course is variations in the weather. So you have some good years with good rain, and you produce a bumper crop. You have some bad years with drought, and you produce little to no crop. And you combine that source of risk with changes in markets. The price of corn might go up or down for various other factors. You have geopolitical factors, you have technological factors that compound the risk. Here's another one that occurred to me. The thing about if you live up north in the snowy parts of the world, you might think about doing a snowplow business. In fact, a lot of the landscaping businesses, they'll do landscaping and moving dirt and that kind of thing in the summer, then they'll plow snow in the winter. Here's an ad for a snowplow. It says profitability is waiting. Well, perhaps if you get a snowy winter. There's not all winters are as snowy. I used to live up north in the Midwest, and some years you'd get a ton of snow, and some years you'd get not so much. So they're going to have variation in how much snow plowing business you get if you're a freelance snowplow operator. Right. So I wouldn't buy this with a short-term view. I wouldn't buy a snowplow thinking I would repay it or have killer earnings in 1 year. You're going to have to think about your average earnings over a 5-10 year period based on averages and the workload you'll get based on the variability of weather. So that's just an example of one source or many sources of variability. You want to think very carefully when you're making an investment or when you're running a business. You need to think very carefully about the sources of variability in the income that your various assets will earn. Okay. We're ready now with the concepts of assets and income and risk to categorize assets, and then think kind of about pros and cons of different classes of assets. And then with all of that under our belt, we'll be ready to tackle the concept of asset valuation. Okay, so assets earn income. They have to be paid for their flow of goods or services. We can categorize assets into 4 basic types, and each one earns a corresponding type of income. So let's spell those out, and then we'll take a look at each kind of income/asset category, and we'll kind of think a little bit about that source of income. So first off, we just have workers, the asset of labor. So labor earns wages, and wages in economic parlance does not refer to just hourly wages the way it's commonly used. It refers to the payment made to labor. It could be an hourly basis, it could be a yearly basis. So when we say wages in economics, we mean hourly or annual payment to labor. So we that is inclusive of the concept of salary. Okay, so we've got labor earning wages. We've got money or capital in a broad sense. And money, of course, cash is a kind of a financial capital category. Earning the income of interest. We have land or fixed assets earning an income of rent. And we have knowledge or initiative, entrepreneurship, earning profit. So income categories of wages, interest, rent, and profit earned by the asset categories of labor, capital, fixed assets, and entrepreneurial knowledge. Let's take a little bit closer look at each one of those and think about some pros and cons of each category. So wages, and wages can be defined as income for contracted employees. Remember, it could be hourly, it could be annual. So when we say wages, that means what we can typically consider hourly wages, but also salaries for annual workers. They're contractually fixed. That's a huge benefit for workers. Workers can avoid fluctuations in their income through contracting for wages. And by and large, although not all labor markets are quite as competitive as others, they're generally set through supply and demand process in competitive labor markets. So they reach an equilibrium. They will equilibrate in some cases quickly, in some cases with something of a lag. And in equilibrium, we can think of the wage as equaling the opportunity cost of time for the marginal worker. When we think about people earning wages, often the first thing that comes to mind is maybe fast food workers making minimum wage. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that they're providing a service. It's a service many people can do, so there's a large supply in that labor market and hence a relatively low wage. Nonetheless, a valuable service to their neighbor. But you don't want to constrain your view of wage work to unskilled or just low income work. You have workers, hourly workers that earn substantially more. Here's coal miners. Looked this data up pretty recently, and they earn something around $21 an hour average. Now, part of that is from the skill. Most of that difference between the fast food workers' low wage and the coal miners' higher wage is due to the danger level of mining. This is what we call a compensating differential for the risks, one of the more deadly jobs. So you have to pay people more to induce them to undertake those risks. How about airline pilots earning a salary wage of over $100,000 a year? What's going on here? Well, largely payment to their human capital, all the training and knowledge it takes to become a pilot, partly also the skill, the dexterity. When we talk about this kind of wage, we actually might say, well, yeah, we call it a wage and we classify this as a wage, but maybe part of that, or a large part of it, is really a interest type of income. It's a payment to the capital component, the knowledge and training component. And it's hard in some cases to disentangle the pure wage, just the payment for the labor or skill, from the human capital component, the return on the investment in a maybe lengthy and complex training process. Okay, and let's just think about some pros and cons of wages. Pros is that they're fixed, predictable, especially in the short run. And that gives workers some stability in terms of knowing that they can earn a certain income, plan for budgeted expenses of housing and food and everything else. The downside, the fixity of wages means they're limited. You can earn that much and no more. Now, of course, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're in a high wage or high salary industry, you could do quite well. Right? But no matter how well the company does or the industry does, the wage earner only earns his wage. Another downside is that there's competition in labor markets that will put downward pressure on wages and push them down ultimately in equilibrium to the opportunity cost of a marginal worker. So if you open up your pool of workers to, for example, immigrants, unskilled immigrants, or if you open up to outsourcing through expanded international trade, you bring in people with lower opportunity costs, and they do indeed put downward pressure on wages. And so what does that do for the domestic workforce? Well, it either leaves them with fewer opportunities to earn higher wages, or gives them an impetus to pursue investment in skills and human capital development such that they are capable of earning higher wages. We've talked about this in international trade. Trade means enhanced competition, and competition has its downsides for individual workers. Of course, the upside is for all consumers. We get more production of more stuff. Remember, everyone has more of everything through free international trade based on comparative advantage and specialization. So there are upsides and downsides. The economists, our story is basically that if we can suffer through the temporary adjustments of enhanced competition, the upside will be worth it for the mass of consumers. Remember, that's all of us, in terms of greater consumption opportunities of all manner of goods and services. Let's address interest now in a little more detail. And interest is the income for suppliers of capital. And so capital can just be money. So people who put up the money that's required to start a business, to buy the machines and equipment, hire the workers, do marketing, so on and so forth. Well, they have to earn a return on that capital, otherwise they wouldn't put it up. And that return is designated interest. Now, if you just put up money kind of passively in the financial markets, you can earn a relatively safe and stable return through investing in debt securities, bonds, or bank accounts for that matter. Properly considered bank accounts, bank certificates of deposit are debt securities. They could be fixed or floating rate. You could have a locked-in rate. For instance, right now you can earn about 1% on bank savings accounts. Maybe you can earn 2.25% on 5-year bank certificates. You could earn maybe an upper 2-3% on long-term government bonds, and then you can earn even more than that. You could earn maybe 4 or 5% on riskier corporate bonds, long-term corporate bonds. Right? So if you have financial capital, pure financial capital money, you can invest it and earn an interest rate that's set in a market process of supply and demand for funds in financial markets. Here's an example, a certificate I owned back in the 90s, when interest rates were considerably higher than they are today. And let me point out some features of this. Notice that the key thing here is I'm earning a 5.4. I've highlighted this, but let me circle it again. 5.4% per annual interest rate over an 11-month term for a set amount of money. So here's my $5,000 balance in this certificate, which I'm investing with the bank for 11 months, and they're going to pay me a fixed rate of 5.4%. This is a fixed debt security, certificate of deposit. Okay, so if you have cash, you can earn an interest rate varying based on the term, on the riskiness of the investment, so on and so forth. And this is something that we need to keep in mind, is interest rate that you could earn on your money always is going to act as a threshold or a comparison for us when we think about running a business. Okay, I can earn 5.4% here by doing nothing, by just handing over my money to First Federal Savings Bank of Colorado. I can sit back and relax while that compounds interest daily. So what's it going to take for me to invest this financial capital, my money, into my own business or another business? Well, I've got to be able to beat this threshold rate of 5.4%. I might want to beat it substantially because there's going to be higher risk of opening my own business or investing in different kind of securities. This security right here of such a small amount of money, it's insured through deposit insurance. It's very low risk. So to invest in a riskier kind of business operation, I might need double that, triple that. I might be looking for 8, 10, 12, 15% prospective return in order to induce me to take that higher risk. So we want to think that interest is always kind of the benchmark or the comparison, that the kind of safe return you can get on a pretty liquid short-term investment like this will be our benchmark for considering investing in a more risky or longer-term opportunities. Some ups and downs or pros and cons of interest. I just mentioned it's passive. You can just invest passively. You don't have to work or manage. You invest in safer securities. You don't even have to worry too much about the safety. Now, if you invest in risky or higher yield securities, you might be up at night worrying about whether they'll default. The fact that debt securities are a contractual obligation does give them a measure of safety that other kinds of equity securities or other kinds of investments don't have. Although there are riskier debt securities, junk bonds get their label because they're a higher propensity to default versus safe, what's called investment grade bonds, for instance. The issuer of debt, the debtor, has contractual obligation to pay the lender of the funds, the creditor, back. So measure of safety there that you don't have with equity securities, where you could lose your entire investment with no legal recourse. The downside is that you might limit your returns. Okay, I'm not going to earn more than 5.4% on this savings certificate. And this is a time when if I had invested this money in the stock market, let's say put it in the S&P 500, I would have been earning probably double-digit returns, at least until the downturn in 2000, 2001. So by acquiring extra safety with a fixed contractual obligation payment, you also lose the upside potential of capturing the growth in productivity and income from other kinds of investments or other kinds of securities. All right, moving on, let's talk about rent. Rent is a payment to asset owners in excess of opportunity cost. And I'll have you read an article about this by one of the great American economists. He spells it out very clearly, but it's a pretty simple concept. And note that there's a difference here in the economic usage of the term rent versus the kind of everyday common usage. The everyday common usage refers to often a lease payment. I pay my monthly rent on my apartment, or farmers can rent ground. Economic usage is talking about a very specific thing: payment in excess of opportunity cost to the owner of a resource. So think about what's the minimum the owner of a resource, an asset, would accept to put that into use. And anything received above that is labeled rent. In fact, we could just as well call this economic rent to differentiate it from that common usage of rent. So whenever I talk about rent in this class, I'm talking about economic rent, payment in excess of opportunity cost. Land and fixed assets often will earn rent. So in some cases, they won't earn rent at all. In some cases, you can own land that's not productive. You don't get any payment for it. You're definitely not earning any income from its use. So just because you own land or a fixed asset does not guarantee you're going to earn rent. In some cases, you own very productive land. You own it free and clear. Let's say you would be willing to offer its use of its services for $1,000 a year. You get $10,000 a year because farmers compete against each other for access to the most productive land. Well, you're earning $9,000 in rent. And let me also mention here what we mean by fixed assets. Land, of course, is fixed in the sense that it's there. We basically have as much land as we'll ever have, although it is possible to create new land through landfill, and that's actually been done in various parts of the world, but it's extremely costly. So land is relatively fixed, especially in the short run. Even in the long run, we can't really add much new land to the stock of existing land, so land is relatively fixed. Now, other kinds of assets, you think about things you could own that produce income. If you're a trucker, you own a truck. We can produce more trucks. Even in the short run, it's pretty easy to expand the supply of trucks. Machinery. If you're a farmer, you could get more tractors, more combines, that kind of thing. So those assets aren't fixed in the sense that there's no more of them available like land is. There are certain produced assets, or there are certain physical assets that are fixed, and I'll show you an example here in a minute. And fixed assets that are productive generally will earn rent. So when we think about these kind of assets, we need to recognize that they're earning rent and not what we might suspect them of earning. I'll get to an example here in a minute that will make this clear, I hope. Okay, and then rent is determined by the scarcity of the asset relative to its productivity. Really productive farmland, it's fixed in supply. Farmers compete against each other for access to it, so they can use it and grow crops. They'll bid up the rent, reflecting that productivity. Even though the owner of the land might be willing to let those farmers use it for a much lower price, the owner says, well, I might as well get as much as I can. Conversely, if you think about what does it cost to get a semi-truck, if you want to be a trucker, you're only going to have to pay basically the cost of producing the truck, because it's a competitive market. There's many suppliers. There's Freightliner, and there's Mack, and there's Peterbilt.
I ain't no Mac, I'm a Peterbilt, for damn sake.
And so Mack can't just decide to jack up the price of its trucks because truckers need that asset. There's competition from Peterbilt and Freightliner, and International, and they'll say, hey, we'll offer you basically the same truck, 600 horsepower truck that will go 1,000,000 miles for a lower price, and those prices will get competed down to cost. We've talked about this. We'll talk about it some more. And so the producers of those productive assets are not going to earn rents. They're just going to earn payments that cover the costs of the land, labor, and capital that go into producing the asset, and no more. But the owners of fixed assets like land or other fixed assets can indeed earn rent more than the cost of kind of maintaining and developing that asset. Now, a key thing that we want to talk about with rent is that rents are dissipated over time. What this means is if you have a really productive asset, and we'll get into some mathematical examples in the next lesson. Right now, I just want to go over the concepts. If you own an asset that's extremely productive, other people will want to own it as well. And what does that mean? That means they'll be willing to pay a higher price. We can think of this in supply and demand terms, which we will soon. They'll shift the demand curve to the right, and that drives up the price. And what happens? Well, the price is going to rise until the yield of the asset is basically equilibrated, made equal to the yield on comparable assets with respect to the risk. So rents will get dissipated over time as long as you have competitive ownership markets. And then new entrants into ownership really don't earn rent. They'll just earn kind of a benchmark equivalent yield. They'll really only earn interest. So rents dissipate to interest. And that means that only the original owners of these kind of fixed assets are the ones who really benefit. And that there's also some tax implications here. You can tax rents with little loss of output or efficiency, because We're talking about gains above and beyond what it takes to get these assets in production anyway. Okay, so it's really important to understand this category. And let's move on and talk about some examples now. Okay, I've talked a lot about land. Here's some really productive farmland. I think it's Iowa. Some of the richest soil in the world, really, in North America, and it grows really good crops of corn, soybeans, what have you. Let's say you settled this land in the early 1800s. You actually could have gotten it for no monetary payment if you homesteaded it, or you bought it from the government relatively cheap as a settler. You develop it, you own it free and clear. What does it take for you to put the land into production? What does a farmer have to pay you per acre to rent the ground so he can grow a crop on it? Well, it might not be that much. It might not take that much. $100 an acre would enable you to cover your cost of having developed the land and give you an income from the land. But if the land produces $10,000 worth of crops per year, well, guess what? The price of the land is going to get bid up to where that $10,000 of crops per acre is going to represent a yield equivalent to what you could get on other kinds of investments. So if you just do some simple math here, let's say this land produces $10,000 of crops on average per year, and you're looking at an interest rate of, just to make the numbers simple, 10% that you could get on your cash. What's the land going to be worth? Well, we're saying 10%, or we're saying $10,000 worth of crops equals 10% of X. $10,000 worth of crops equals 0.1x, and when we solve that, divide by 0.1, we'll see that this land is worth 100,000. Okay, now land, as I mentioned, is kind of the classic fixed asset. So when we think about what earns rent, land, it often comes to mind. But that's not the only fixed asset. Let me think about a person who would supply labor services for a much lower payment than he or she actually enjoys. Here's the highest paid man in basketball, LeBron James, with the reigning champion Cleveland Cavaliers. And he is earning $24 million a year to play. Now, and that's just his basketball salary. There's more money from endorsements and whatnot. But here's the question. Would he play for less than $24 million? Okay. Now, we know he's smart and his agent's smart, and he knows that he can get that much. So he's going to hold out maybe until he gets that top dollar. But would he pay in an alternative world where he didn't get that kind of offer? Would he play for only $20 million or only $10 million or maybe only $1 million? He's getting kind of later in his career, so he might just say, nah, it's not worth it for $1 million. But I would guarantee you that when he was a younger man, he would have played for $1 million or maybe even 100,000, because that would beat out the opportunity cost. Now he's a big, strong guy, so there's a lot of different kinds of jobs he could do. He could just go out and do physical labor. I'm sure he's a pretty smart guy, so he could have gone through college and got a business degree and done business careers. So the question is, what else could he have earned? Let's say he could have earned $50,000 a year doing construction, or $100,000 a year eventually doing some kind of business management field. So when you think about what else could he have earned doing something that he probably doesn't like doing as much, he arguably really loves basketball. So let's say he could have only earned $100,000 doing something he doesn't like as much. Would he have played basketball for only $110,000? For only $200,000? For only $1 million? Sure. So anything above and beyond that is rent. So I would suggest to you that vast bulk of LeBron James' salary of $24 million is an economic rent. It's a payment above and beyond his opportunity cost. What else he could have earned, his next best alternative. And in a world where this kind of basketball skill is very rare, what's the function of rent? Well, we need this rent to induce him to play, and teams have to bid up his value by paying him rent in order to acquire this level of talent. And let's just think about, does that work? Well, sure. He won 2 championships when he went to play with the Heat, and Cleveland brought him back for even higher salary, and he's already won them a championship. So we can recognize there's a function of rent. It's not needed to get this person to do this work, but it is needed to allocate this resource to whoever wants it the most. And we'll talk more about rent in the next lesson and how it gets dissipated. And ultimately it collapses to interest for assets for which there are ownership in markets. Now we don't have ownership in markets for people. People own themselves. So individuals can enjoy a rent, ongoing rent over their own skill and talent level. Okay, some pros and cons of rent. Rents are not guaranteed. They can fluctuate. When we thought about the rent earned by land, well, weather's a big factor there. Weather's usually a variable around an average, so it's not going to affect the long run rent maybe too much. There's market factors, supply and demand for factors changes, supply and demand for the products that they can produce changes, and that will reduce or increase the value of the fixed asset that produces them. There's factors within the asset itself. In the case of Mr. James, he's going to grow old and wear out and not be able to play anymore, so he won't be able to earn his rent in perpetuity. Even in the case of land, it in a sense wears out over time. Its nutrients are depleted, so you do have to do maintenance on the land. You might have to let it lie fallow or fertilize it. Okay, so there is a variance. There's no guarantee of rent. Even if you have the ultimate fixed asset, there could be supply and demand, preference changes in people. If in a strange scenario where people don't like basketball anymore, well, the value of LeBron services would fall to zero. And the downside, we just kind of talked about this, there's management and maintenance required to keep up the value, the productivity of the fixed assets. Okay, there's the finite lifespan. Rents are not contractually guaranteed. In the long run, rents can rise or fall based on all these different factors and risks that we just mentioned. Okay, and finally, let's round out this discussion by talking about profit. Profit is properly thought of as a residual income for entrepreneurs, the people who own and operate and manage business enterprises. And what do we mean by residual? Well, properly speaking, it's what's left after everything else has been paid. So the wages for the labor, human capital input, the interest for the capital, physical capital input, the rent for any fixed asset inputs that are needed, and then anything that's left over after all of that has been paid is profit for the entrepreneur. Now, there's of course a big downside to this, is this could be a negative number if the business has lost money and the entrepreneur then takes a loss. So when we say profit, we should technically talk about loss as well, because they're kind of two sides of the coin. Now, what determines how profitable you are? Well, there's several factors. The ones an entrepreneur can influence or control are the knowledge level, knowledge of the market, knowledge of customers, knowledge of product, knowledge of rivals. Knowledge is the kind of the core of entrepreneurship. We might add to that the idea of risk taking. Lots of people take risks. Not all of them are entrepreneurs. And not all risk is done on the basis of superior knowledge. But when it is, there's a chance for an entrepreneur to earn profits. And then finally, innovativeness. And we've talked about how the market process, the competitive process, pushes constant innovation. That's going to be the source of profit in the long run, because innovations made by company A can be copied by companies B, C, and D, and then we'll see that familiar process of competition, replication of product, price wars, lowering of costs, lowering of price for the consumers, and profits are ultimately constantly being dissipated or eliminated through that competitive process. So if you want to maintain and keep profits, you have to have innovation. Now, if we got to a long-run equilibrium, we might actually never get there, but if we did get to a long-run equilibrium, and we're talking about a world where nothing really changes, and we're in a kind of a situation of economic rest, there's constant preferences, constant technology, constant cost of producing, profits will go completely away, and businesses are just earning, what are they earning? Labor component's earning its wages, the capital component's earning its interest, and any fixed assets, if needed, are earning their rent. As far as any investors in the business are concerned, what should they expect to earn? In the long run, you should expect to earn interest in competitive markets. In the like manner, exit eliminates losses. Firms that are losing money will leave, driving supply down, cost and price up, as we're familiar with. So in the long run, you're earning interest only. Now let's think about pros and cons. The big attraction of profits is that there is no upper limit. They're not contractually fixed. Some firms have been fantastically profitable. Henry Ford was fantastically profitable in the 1920s with the Model T. Steve Jobs and Apple were fantastically profitable in the 2000s with the iPhone. Okay, the examples here abound, but there's no upper limit. Of course, you could lose all of your investment. You can't lose more than your investment, especially with the limited liability corporation format. Okay, but notice that it's riskier. I could put my money in a CD and get 5.4% for sure. I could put my money in my own business and sky's the limit as far as my upside, or I could lose it all as far as my downside. So entrepreneurship in general and the concept of earning profits in general riskier than all the other forms of income. You do have freedom and flexibility of owning your own company. Of course, that's also that has a flip side over here of the constant challenge of managing and keeping alive the company. So it's maybe kind of a 25-hour-a-day type job, if you will. There's a lot of stress and uncertainty. You're up all night wondering how you're going to pay the bills, how you're going to keep up with the competition, whether you're going to win a bid for a job, whether consumers will like your new product, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's conclude, and we're kind of preparing for what we're ready to talk about now. We have all the asset categories and income categories down. We're ready to start talking about the equilibration of returns. The principle that asset values adjust until their risk-weighted returns are equalized. Again, we go back to the concept of a long-run equilibrium, which is purely hypothetical. We, in actuality, probably never really get there because things are always changing, but think about the tendencies where we would go if things didn't change. Rent is all dissipated away through a bidding up of the asset values until the earnings on a fixed asset just represents basically the opportunity cost of what you could get in any other asset. Profit is competed away until the business is earning only interest. And by the way, notice here that all that remains is interest. If you own a fixed asset, but its value is bid up until you're no longer earning rents, or if you go into business, your profits competed away until you're no longer earning profits, all that remains for the owner of the asset is interest. Unless if we're talking about a human capital asset, a labor asset, we could be talking about kind of a basic wage component that can be competed away as well. So here's the big question. This is really almost the most important question of this entire course. How do entrepreneurs generate or maintain rent or profits? And that's what we'll be talking more about in the coming lessons. Stay tuned.